All right, Ray, you're live.
Thanks. My phone is ringing, darn it. So
Probably someone looking for the meeting.
Jim Carr said he couldn't get in, so I tried to tell him how to do it. Anyway, this is our header slide, and we're having the theme this year of stream health and good fishing. Next slide, please. So, and we're keyed in on Aldo Leopold's word about what health is. It's the capacity for self-renewal, a very useful concept. Next. And yesterday we heard from Mark Beardsley, Rebecca Flitcroft, and Jason Dunham. And today, next slide, we'll hear first from Chris Jordan on the question, so you want to do some stream restoration? Then from Rebecca again, but this time she's going to talk about connectivity, a very timely topic for Wisconsin since there are a lot of culverts to be removed and a lot of dams to be removed, although Wisconsin has removed more dams maybe than any other state. And lastly, Eric Booth will have a home state presentation on the attributes of grass and trees in along streams and their use in suitability in restoration. Next. So our first speaker is Chris Jordan, and he's a research fisheries biologist with the federal Northwest Fisheries Science Center. He's trained as a mathematical biologist and has worked on a wide range of biological topics, all with an emphasis on developing or applying quantitative methods. His work has focused on monitoring programs to assess freshwater habitat and population status, as well as the watershed scale effect of management for anadromous salmonids. And I'd like to stress that we're particularly interested in watershed analysis. Watershed scale looks at our situation. Chris's current projects involve developing process-based methods for stream restoration, among many other things. So we look forward to hearing from you, Chris.
This is Chris Jordan with the National Marine Fisheries Service, Northwest Fisheries Science Center. Today, I want to talk to you about stream restoration. Specifically, I want to talk to you about the history of stream restoration. Modern stream restoration was born in the U.S. about 100 years ago. It was born in the trout streams of the Northeast. It was born from efforts to squeeze every last fish or fishing opportunity from the streams. Streams that had been impaired because of land use activities, fish populations that had been impacted by overfishing, but in general was based on the idea that putting structures in the streams would improve the stream's productivity of trout. And this is really neat work that's been summarized in a number of papers by Douglas Thompson. One of the interesting observations from the studies of the history of stream restoration in the U.S. is comparing manuals of stream restoration practices from 100 years ago to current. Here are diagrams of stream restoration structures that you would still see installed today, but in fact, these are reproductions of instruction manuals from 100 years ago. So what that says is our practices today come from these early implementers of stream restoration. These are early implementers of attempts to modify streams to make trout habitat. These early attempts to influence the biology and the physics of streams. Those same practices are still in place today. Those early efforts of trying to jam the most fish out and fishing opportunities out of a stream were called stream farming. It has a negative connotation because of the idea that streams could be modified to any degree. More structures would result in more fish or more fishing opportunities. In reality, those streams and rivers experienced an enormous human impact. A human impact that approached some of the more damaging impacts that we see in streams today. Normally, when I think of streams as being impaired from human activities, it's because we've done things like this, taken away all the water. Or this, added cows, too many cows. Or this, dropped a city right on top of a river. So, what should stream restoration be? How can we make this better? So a call from this analysis of this 100 years history of stream restoration in North America is for a new approach that focuses on replicating these natural processes and patterns such that the function of streams is recovered. So let's look at some modern examples of stream restoration. Taking this idea of replicating natural processes and pattern to generate function. All right, you ready? Wow, look at these beauties. Now that looks like a functional stream to me. Really restored. This one, man, amazing how logs come with cables. And the margin between where the stream is and where the vegetation starts is so clean. And this one, my goodness, I never knew that streams came in such perfect sinusoids. And here, distressed wood thrown in at jaunty angles, nice pavers lining the banks and the pools. This is modern stream restoration. Yeah, it is. It's form-based restoration. It's engineering. Nothing has changed. This is 100 years on, and we still have the same building structures. Detailed designs for a pool here, a piece of cover there. This is expensive. And it's expensive work because it's very labor intensive. It's expensive because of the engineering. It's expensive because of the design assumptions, stability, no erosion, nothing will move. This reach will not be gaining or losing. Now, that's not to say that this hard engineering is inappropriate in some places. This is the Truckee River in downtown Reno. This is exactly what needs to be done in this urban setting. And it's a really cool project that results in lots of accommodation space for high flows and different hydrological and hydraulic functions across a wide range of flows. But this isn't an urban setting. There isn't the need for this level of engineering and restoration. So, what's happened to stream restoration? Stream restoration has become an industry. While the basic ideas behind stream restoration and maybe how to measure its efficacy is a research enterprise, the tools, the training, the doing of stream restoration is an industry in the private sector, something that I call the restoration industrial complex. And if we look at what that complex has done over the last few decades, we can see that it is an industry that's booming. It's $1 billion a year industry. So the black dots on this figure tracking the increase of restoration, stream restoration projects reported. This is using public dollars to generally for fish habitat improvement from the 80s into the mid-2000s, thousands of projects per year. A little bit of science. Here's articles that have been published around doing stream restoration, but really the practice is booming. No place is it booming more than in the Pacific Northwest, and that's because of the Endangered Species Act listings of salmon and steelhead on the entire West Coast. So in this inset figure, these colored polygons are the areas, the groups of populations that each constitute a single listing. For steelhead, almost down to the U.S.-Mexico border, up through Puget Sound with steelhead and Chinook, all the way up to Canada. And inland, all the way up to Columbia and into the Snake and the Salmon River of Idaho up to the Montana border. Pretty much everywhere in the Northwest where you have salmon, you now have Endangered Species Act listed salmon. And one of the big issues for that listing, and potentially then a tool for leveraging delisting, is stream habitat condition. And that brings in the restoration industrial complex. Here's a map of restoration projects in Oregon, Washington, Idaho since listing. So listings happened in the mid-1990s. So the last 25 years, there's nearly 40,000 stream restoration projects in this area. Those are targeting fish habitat to benefit salmon and steelhead. So how are they doing? Whoops, not quite so good. Look at this, 25 years on, and no salmon and steelhead major population group or evolutionary significant unit or distinct population segment, those are the units of listing, is doing any better than it was when it was listed 25 years ago, despite all of that work. So what's wrong? Do we not know what we're doing? How do we even evaluate these projects so that we would do another project? How do we assess what the value of stream restoration is? In general, stream restoration is evaluated for its effectiveness by looking at the numbers of fish nearby a project. So some cool work from Kurt Fausch's lab in the mid-90s in the Rocky Mountains looked at groups of restoration projects and found that yes, in fact, there was a higher biomass of trout around restoration actions. But they also noticed that these restoration structures were fish attracting devices, a fad. That the population biomass wasn't increasing, the fish were redistributing themselves. Poor habitat throughout the system, a few structures that might provide cover or increased foraging opportunities, and the fish redistributed themselves to these restoration actions. The restoration folks are evaluating them as being really effective because there are a lot of fish around them, but that's not really changing the underlying biological processes. So evaluating the numbers or the biomass isn't getting at the question of what the fish population is doing. It's not asking, is there a survival change or a population growth rate change? So is this a science problem or is this an implementer's problem? Do we even recognize what good fish habitat looks like? Do we recognize what a restored stream should be? Interestingly, these researchers asked just that question at the freshwater biology meeting a couple of years ago by asking the audience in this symposium to draw what a stream reach, when it was restored, what it would look like. So here's a straightened stream that had been changed to drain the landscape. And you are the restoration practitioner, and you happen to be an aquatic biologist. So this is a science audience. Draw this restored stream reach. Apply your science knowledge. And this is what happened. 80% of the answers were a nice single-threaded wiggly channel. Nice consistent waveform, as if that was the pinnacle of restoration. A few of the drawings added a bit of complexity, a little vegetation, and maybe one or two had non-perfect waveform, or maybe even some branches in there. And not plant branches, but branching of the stream network. So what have we lost? What have we lost from our, or never even had, from our ecological knowledge, our knowledge of a system, our view of what streams are? And then what have we lost on the landscape? What we've lost are these functioning, vibrant, valley-spanning, fully connected floodplain systems. A stream or river connected to its floodplain is a biofluvial geomorphic system. Bio for the plants and animals, fluvial for the flowing water, geo for the alluvial material on the banks and the bed, and morph for the form or shape. So the form of a connected floodplain is not the distribution of volumetric flow rates it experiences, nor the distribution of particle sizes in the beds and the banks, nor the distribution of living things across its surface. Not one of these things alone, but all of them together. Each of these elements and the processes that link them, transport and deposition of sediment, biogeochemical nutrient cycles, growth and death of riparian plants, drive the form and function of intact connected floodplains. Disrupt any one of these processes and the entire system unravels. Understanding the interdependencies, these connections, that's the foundation of process-based restoration. Process-based restoration is the practice of working with, not against, natural and physical biological systems. It's not the imposition of form, but it's the rehabilitation of function. Process-based restoration is the other side of the coin from form-based restoration. Process-based restoration involves embracing the root cause of the impairment. If the upslope, uplands in your watershed, land use practices are the problem, then working in the stream is not process-based restoration. It also involves admitting to the scale of the problem. So if the entire watershed is impaired, working in 500 meters of the watershed is not, again, embracing the process and fixing the process. Process-based restoration is work that is consistent with the site in terms of the dynamics, the resilience, and the natural processes. Process-based restoration is function, not form. Here's a classic example of form-based restoration, telling the creek where it should be. Here's the creek's response. Form-based restoration is an arrogant, unidirectional command. Process-based restoration is a two-way conversation with a stream, a river, or a floodplain. It starts with questions, and it ends with a mutually agreeable plan. A great model of how streams are built and how they fall apart from a process standpoint is the Clure-and-Thorne channel evolution model. In its natural state, a channel connected to its floodplain sits on top of the floodplain. Multiple channels, riparian vegetation, filling valley wall to valley wall, the entirety of the active floodplain. As those processes get out of balance, in this case, the transport-deposition balance switching more to transport, taking the channel from being multi-threaded sitting on top of the floodplain to becoming simplified, overcapacity, and downcutting into the alluvium and becoming incised, and all of the other symptoms of an incised, disconnected floodplain result. To restore that balance and process takes time, so this can happen naturally, or it can take human intervention in the form of restoring the process. This is not something that can be fixed with form-based restoration. It has to be addressed with process-based restoration. And you can see those processes playing out as that balance of transport and deposition is recovered, and aggradation happens across the floodplain surface, reconnecting the channel to the floodplain in a way that's appropriate for the flow regime in this site. Low-tech process-based restoration is a suite of principles and practices that embraces a minimally invasive approach to restoring the balance of hydrologic, hydraulic, geomorphic, and biomorphic processes. Two of the primary tactics of low-tech process-based restoration are PALS, post-assisted log structures, to mimic the role of wood recruitment, and BDAs, beaver dam analogs, to mimic the role of beaver dams. In this panel, there's three examples of PALs: bank attached, mid-channel, or channel spanning, and here are some examples of BDAs, or beaver dam analogs, built with posts and also built without posts. Overall, this light touch to process-based restoration takes a reach or complex of structures approach. It focuses on density and extent. Each of these small treatments, each of the structures itself has a role, but they work in conjunction with each other and the landscape setting. So thinking about designing a low-tech process-based restoration project, we look at the assemblage of all of these structures, giving each structure a role, but realizing that they're going to work together. Each structure's role fits in part of the puzzle of restoring those four process axes: hydraulic, hydrologic, geomorphic, or biomorphic. And each of the types of structures, PALs or BDAs, has a slightly different role or slightly different ability depending on the setting. For example, here is the expected results in hydraulic and geomorphic dimensions for a single PALs, in this case, a mid-channel structure. So sitting in the middle of the channel, it's obviously going to split flow, and that's going to have downstream effects, geomorphic responses from scour. That's going to have lateral responses by pushing water and sediment sideways, and it's going to have an upstream shadow that's going to cause upstream deposition. These are the geomorphic and hydraulic responses, but we do these restoration projects often for a biological response. And so how do the biological response, in this case salmonids, fit into the objectives of this restoration design? So this wood recruitment, or a PALS placement, results in flow complexity. We already saw that from the geomorphic and hydraulic response. That has immediate benefits to fish in terms of making shear zones, which are foraging hotspots, and making slow water, which is flow refugia for resting. That flow complexity is going to result in jets, which are going to result in scour, which are going to make more features within the channel. Some of those features might be bars, which from sediment sorting and riffles are going to make concealment habitat for juveniles or spawning habitat for adults, and so on. So we start with the processes that are impaired, add structures that are going to change and heal those processes that will have direct biological benefits. Low-tech process-based restoration project design, as I said, starts with these building blocks of the structures, but those structures are built into complexes, and those complexes be multiple complexes over a reach for the entire project goal. Obviously, then, there are multiple space and time scales involved. So the individual structures are going to be functioning on the tens of meters of scales and acting over a day or so. A single flow event at a structure can make significant change. Those structures work in complexes over hundreds to thousands of meters, and that time scale is going to take months to years as those structures evolve through complexes, structures working together as complexes. That entire change happens over a larger and larger scale, but it takes longer. These are, as I said, this gentle, slow conversation with a stream. You might imagine that those simple structures don't really do anything, but let's look at some before and after pictures as one year, in general, one flow season. So here's a mid-channel PAL. After 1 year, you notice that it has caused a jet here on river right. There's a lot of deposition over here on river left, and there's a fundamentally different shaped channel because of the changes in processes that one small structure resulted in. Similarly, looking downstream at a channel spanning PALs, notice this deposition of cobble and gravel upstream in that hydraulic shadow, the racking up of wood material because this acts as in a sense a strainer of things in the stream, and notice all sort of a bed elevation in general. So aggradation is happening. Similarly, for a bank attached PAL here, after a single season, notice the elaboration of channels, the complexity that is increased, and notice mostly all of the recruitment of gravel and cobbles upstream and downstream and the splitting of channel as a result of this simple structure. So these simple structures work. Simple structures work in concert with each other, and you can make landscape or riverscape change with them. Here's some cool data from the Soton IMW project in southeast Washington, where they've been putting in PALs over the last 6 years, almost 700 of them, and tracking them to say what happens as each of these structures evolves. So let's look at 3 of their treatment streams and what happens to the PALs through time over 5 years, 5 or 6 years. Yes, some of them get washed away, 10 to 20% in some of these creeks, but that material gets recruited someplace else. So there are new structures that are built of this material. There are structures that get larger. And so while some of them do get changed, that material is captured. That meal is consumed by the stream because we're pushing off the processes, starting processes and not expecting that a structure is built. That structure needs to stay there and stay with its function. Its function is to participate in the processes of the creek. So does this work? Let's look at a project. So here's an incised stream. Beaver dam analogs were installed, and you get this enormous elaboration of inundation area, 228% increased inundation. The side channel length increases by over 1,000% because the floodplain engagement processes were reinitiated. You can see that just in the water surface. Here's a non-treated area through time over the 10 years of the project. From the start of the project to 10 years into the project. Here's that treated area. The red lines are the treatments, in this case BDAs, and notice the elaboration of the water surface extent. As that water piles up on the surface, spreads out over the surface, start to engage a series of hydrologic processes. One of the most notable hydrologic responses is riparian vegetation. So as the water starts to pile up on the surface and spread out, vegetation is changed from xeric, so red in these before false color imagery, to green the mesic vegetation more influenced by water. Clearly, the expansion of riparian vegetation is made possible through the access to water. Water both on the surface and water in the hyporheic aquifer and shallow groundwater. So here is the groundwater elevation as a result of those treatments, those process-based treatments, and the untreated versus treated. So there's a 25 to 30 centimeter increase in the groundwater elevation all across the floodplain surface. Engaging surface water with groundwater has dramatic effects on stream temperature. Here's stream temperature loggers in an untreated, simplified, impaired reach, and here's temperature loggers, these red dots, in a BDA-treated area. And let's just look at the temperature traces from these temperature loggers. In the simplified area, these loggers all have about the same temperature, so the temperature diversity laterally in the hottest part of the summer, in July, is 0 across this area. Whereas in the BDA treated, so this more complexified area, and restoring those hydraulic and hydrologic processes, we see that some of these temperature loggers all have the same temperature, but we also notice that some of them are about groundwater, hyporheic aquifer temperature of 11 degrees being released into the channel, and obviously a mixing across those. So that is causing some temperature heterogeneity at the reach scale, at the individual structure scale. Obviously, other biogeochemical processes are changed. So we've elaborated riparian vegetation. So here's a cross-section of a simplified to a more complex riparian channel. And as a result, you're changing the length scales of the nutrient cycling. You're allowing more processing to happen, as well as having a larger source of allochthonous input. That biogeochemical cycles happen in biofilm on the substrate. By having more water moving from the surface into the hyporheic aquifer, you're getting more exchange and engaging more of the substrate in order to have space for doing this biogeochemical processing, and therefore these are more productive reaches. And you can see that in the fish response. So here are juvenile trout or steelhead, Oncorhynchus micus, in the treated and untreated areas of this project. And the overall abundance of the fish in the treated to untreated parts of the watershed increased by 168%, and their seasonal survival, this every 3 months, increased by 50%. And what's most amazing about this is the treatment itself. It was 4 kilometers out of 36 kilometers that the fish data was collected over. So about an eighth of the watershed was actually treated, but you still had this population level effect. So this is a profound change in the quality and quantity of habitat that's possible with this light touch, low tech process-based approach. So to conclude, we have many impaired streams. Here's a simplified stream, the single channel in size, pushed up against its channel margin. If we release its processes and return it to its healthy self, that stream now occupies the full floodplain. It's a vibrant, connected system. So, I'd like to layer on another problem, climate change. A changing climate amplifies the impact of impaired riverscapes. Increased air temperature and drier conditions stresses valley bottom vegetation that's already disconnected from the hyporheic aquifer, driving wildfires into megafire conditions. Snow-driven flow regimes are shifting to rain-driven, bringing lower, warmer base flows and further degraded biotic conditions. More frequent extreme precipitation events in overcapacity channels leads to more flooding. So restoring floodplain connectivity and function is both a climate change mitigation and adaptation strategy. The science is robust. It's comprehensive. It's clear. We should be implementing these low-tech process-based restoration methods in integrated streams across the continent to kickstart the restoration processes. We should rewrite our beaver management policies to actively support coexistence over lethal management so that if and when beavers arrive in a riverscape, they can thrive. We should educate wildlife managers, land managers, and the public about the incredible value these ecosystems, these connected floodplain systems, can bring to our communities. We need to apply our knowledge of the physical and biological processes of functioning riverscapes to drive rapid, comprehensive, and durable action. Actions that address the pervasive degraded North American streams. Actions that rebuild natural functioning dynamics of riverscapes to permit robust responses to disturbance. Actions that in fact should form the National Freshwater Climate Action Plan. Thank you.
Well, thank you very, very much, Chris. That was terrific. Gave us a lot to think about. In particular, I want to say how appropriate it was for certain parts of the Midwest. We have people in the audience from Wisconsin particularly, but also from Minnesota, Michigan, and Ontario. And all of those states have salmon streams. These are alien species, but they're here and people appreciate them. And every once in a while, somebody asks us, well, why don't you have some special information having to do with development of better habitat for salmon in these Great Lakes tributaries? Well, folks, you've just heard it. You've heard a lot, and it included information about using beaver, and beaver may very well turn out to be quite appropriate for steep streams along the Great Lakes shorelines. So I particularly appreciate that. And if anybody has further questions, what have we got in the chat here?
I was just letting people know that we will send out a PDF of these references as well. And I'd invite anybody who wants to ask a question to just unmute themselves and feel free to ask away. All right, we have Desiree and then Carl.
Hey, Chris, thanks for your presentation. Sorry, I'm in the middle of cooking dinner, so I'm hopefully you can hear me okay. I'm curious if you can comment on the process that y'all have experienced with these projects in terms of permitting and I don't know if resistance is the right word, but how do you get, for example, a no rise analysis permit, or from FEMA, or can you comment on the permitting process for these projects? Thanks.
Yeah, Desiree, that's a great question. A resistance is probably a good description. And I think most of the resistance comes from the novelty, right? This is different. These are different approaches. They're asking the same thing. We're changing stream roughness. And so the no rise, the HH analysis is the same. The floodplain engagement is what we're asking for. And so it's not going to be any necessarily easier to do through the permitting process, though in some cases we are trying to get some forms of expedited consideration, mainly under Endangered Species Act, because of the idea that these are low risk. These are structures that are with a design lifespan for 1 year. So this is not an engineered structure that if you make a mistake, it's going to take a lot of work to remove it, or the stream will respond in a very negative way. As you saw with those Asotan examples with the PALs, if the structure wasn't quite to kick off the process at that spot, then the stream takes care of it and moves it around. And so that makes the structures not long-term in a particular location. And so if someone has a concern about fish passage, for example, at a structure as part of a complex, the intention is to change the hydraulics. The intention is to change the plan form and longitudinal form of the stream. And so so passage concerns are going to change through time. And in particular with the BDAs, they're meant to mimic beaver dams. And so we have been working hard to educate state and federal agencies around the natural passability of beaver dams for migratory fish. These are animals, the beaver and the fish, that have co-evolved or at least coexisted. We don't need to make it as fancy as coevolution, but certainly coexisted across their range and reestablished themselves post-glaciation in the Northwest, and certainly into the glaciated areas of Wisconsin and Minnesota. And so animals have reinvaded the territory together, and there could not be inherently fish passage barriers if that wasn't the case. So I think it's to summarize, it's new structures, it's new ideas, it's new approaches, it's larger extents. So it's not just it's not one structure, it's a complex, and complexes together. So you're talking about saying it's 100+ structures you're going to put in over a couple of years on 5 kilometers. That's the scale of the project, and that's different. And also the fact that you're going to enter into the stream each year for 5 years, as opposed to you're going to come in and you do your site restoration and move on. It's a very different approach, and tending to be the light touch, which eventually we can get permitting questions through. But you're right. It is an uphill battle, and I'm hoping it will get easier.
Just a quick follow-up question for you on that. Thinking in the Midwest context, you make it sound like some of these structures are sort of intended to move on, but some of that material may end up somewhere where maybe people don't appreciate it ending up. So I'm thinking of road crossings, dams, other structures downstream. How do you get around explaining to people that, yes, you're putting some material in that's going to move, and it may move where you don't really need it to? How do you get people to buy into that?
Great question, Eric. We expect every structure to move. It will either be incorporated into the stream plan form, as we've seen some structures, or be rearranged, and that's fine. Or as the channel migrates, it'll be abandoned. These are small pieces of wood. We don't use any machinery to put the wood in. These are pieces of wood that 2 people can carry. We call them 2-body wood, and so this is something that we don't imagine it's going to do damage to infrastructure. It's also something that can rack up and hang up easily on it goes. So I realize with large wood placements, there's big concern about mobile wood, which is where engineered log jams, cabling logs came from, is because of poorly designed bridges and poorly designed culverts that then they could clog and damage. But we try not to contribute to that problem by using small material.
Got it. Great.
But yes, it's intentionally mobile. Absolutely.
Yep. Carl has a question.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. So I guess I've been hearing these talks about process-based versus form-based and the use of that terminology. And I'm not sure I see the quite as distinct a line between them, in that, when you think about physical processes like sediment transport, it's based on the channel dimensions. When you think about connectivity to the floodplain, that's a function of the form of the channel. Habitat in the stream is related to form when you talk about things like pool depth, which directly relate to ecological processes in the stream. And what it seems like the discussion is more about, not so much a form-based versus a process-based, because each of them are going to affect processes in certain ways based on the form. It's more a difference in form approach, which is multi-thread versus single-thread channel. And, I heard you imply a few times, for example, that what you call form-based restoration typically doesn't restore connectivity with the floodplain, and rightfully so. That's one of the most important things you can do. But I don't know that that's necessarily our projects that don't provide that floodplain connectivity isn't necessarily a function of, that's what you're calling form-based process or form-based restoration approach preaches or teaches or whatever, so much as there are examples where that happens. So I think that, there's good discussion between the two groups possibly. And I feel like, trying to present it as 2 different, completely opposite approaches maybe is keeping us from getting to, a better coordination in a lot of the ways that we approach these. And I don't know what you think about those comments.
Yeah, I think we're running out of time, but I will absolutely rise to that. A great question. I'm talking about structures, which are still forms, right? But I think it's the intention. So when I think of form-based restoration, I think here is a structure that's designed to provide something. It's going to scour a pool. So that's doing process, but that is artificially making a structure that you are going to say stays there. Natural channel design armors the banks such that channel migration doesn't happen. So there's natural processes that are removed through that imposition of form. A process-based approach is saying, I'm going to try to kick off processes that are either out of balance or maybe even missing. And so there, you need to do some intervention, and you may do an intervention which looks like a project that has some form, but it is not meant to cause a local response only. It's part of changing the balance of processes throughout on a much larger scale. So I think it's also an issue of scale. A form-based action, the way I interpret it, is acting locally, whereas you're tripping off a set of processes with multiple interventions that are changing processes on a much larger scale. And so I do see them as philosophically different, using exactly the same tools. In some cases, you could use what looks like this process-based tool and put it in a form-based way and think that you're doing process, or claim that you're doing process-based restoration, and you aren't, right? If you used 8-inch posts and pound them in so they'd never move, that's the same thing as an engineered logjam, and you don't get any credit for process-based restorationing it. So I think there are some subtle differences, and yes, I think the differences are easy to get lost in trying to make the point. So I appreciate your comment.
Thanks, Chris. And it's particularly interesting to note that nature does not use vertical poles. So thanks for bringing that out. We're going to move on, but I just wanted to make one more comment with something you brought up, Chris. You talked about natural channel design, and that is, of course, well-intentioned, but a really ridiculous phrase. As Colin Thorne brought out a couple of years ago at our workshop, natural channels are not designed, they evolve. So